The airplane cabin shimmered under the soft glow of overhead lights, pale leather seats reflecting the quiet wealth of business class. Rachel Harper stepped aboard, her soft brown hair framing her gentle face, a white handkerchief peeking from her coat pocket like a whisper of comfort. Her hands shook slightly, clutching a sponsored ticket she'd nearly turned away, her first time in this exclusive world. The air buzzed with the scent of expensive cologne and the murmur of privilege, but the stairs cut through it all. A woman in a sharp blazer reclined, her voice slicing the silence. "Who let a preschool teacher up here?" Laughter erupted, cold and sharp, echoing off the cabin walls. A man with a gold watch leaned forward, his smirk venomous. "You're lost, sweetheart. Economy's where you belong." Rachel's cheeks burned, her unassuming smile fading as she lowered her eyes to the floor, the sting of their words sharper than the recycled air. She slipped into her seat, her fingers tightening on the handkerchief, its delicate stitches grounding her against the rising humiliation. The cabin settled, but the weight of their judgment lingered, a heavy fog she couldn't escape. Then a piercing cry broke through, a baby's wail from a few rows ahead, held in the awkward arms of a tall man with hollow eyes. Passengers groaned, their irritation palpable, the flight attendant hovering with a helpless frown. The woman in the blazer sighed loudly, her voice dripping with disdain. "Can't someone make that child stop?" Rachel glanced around, the stairs now pinning her like a spotlight, daring her to act. Her heart raced, but she stood, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can try." The man looked up, his guarded gaze meeting hers, and nodded. She stepped forward, her hands steady despite the trembling in her chest, and gently lifted the baby, cradling her against her shoulder. The crying softened, then stopped, the cabin falling into a stunned hush. The man watched, his striking frame tense, but his eyes flickered with something new, a quiet awe. The woman in the blazer scoffed, her tone biting. "What a saint, playing nanny in business class." Rachel returned to her seat, the baby now asleep, her handkerchief damp with tiny tears, its fabric warm against her skin. The flight stretched on, clouds drifting past the window like ghosts, but the man's gaze never left her, lingering with an intensity that made her breath catch. The other passengers whispered, their mockery a low hum, but Rachel sat still, her hands folded around the handkerchief, its stitches a silent promise of the kindness she refused to let go. She didn't know who the man was, a widower, a CEO, a father carrying a grief too heavy to name, nor did she realize the weight of her simple act. The plane soared through the sky, its engines a steady hum, but the tension in the cabin simmered, a prelude to a story none of them could foresee. Rachel glanced at the man again, his eyes still on her, and a question flickered in her mind, one she couldn't yet voice. The handkerchief felt heavier now, a clue to a connection she didn't understand, and as the plane began its descent, the city lights of New York glimmered below, hinting at a truth waiting to unfold in the shadows of their shared silence. But they didn't know, she wasn't just a passenger, and the man watching her wasn't just a stranger. The terminal's glass walls shimmered with the pale gray of early dawn, casting a cold light across the bustling airport as travelers hurried past with their rolling suitcases. Rachel Harper sat alone on a chilled metal bench, her soft brown hair spilling over her shoulders, the white handkerchief spread across her lap like a fragile map of her broken past. Her fingers brushed its worn stitches, a gift from a student's mother years ago, a token from when she believed her kindness could change the world. Now, that belief felt like a distant echo, shattered by the woman's cruel words from the flight. "Who let a preschool teacher up here?" The mockery replayed in her mind, each syllable a dagger, stripping away the confidence she'd fought to rebuild. 3 years ago, her life had collapsed, her fiancé walked out without a word, her savings vanished under the weight of her father's endless hospital bills, and his death left her adrift. Teaching became her sanctuary, a classroom where small hands and bright eyes kept her going, but even that felt unsteady now. The sponsored ticket to New York, her chance at a prestigious school, should have been a triumph, yet those taunts turned it into a reminder of her inadequacy. She closed her eyes, the baby's piercing cries from the flight flooding back, the tall man's hollow gaze burning into her memory. His striking frame had trembled with uncertainty, his hands fumbling with the child, a grief mirroring her own etched into his face. She'd wanted to ask, to offer comfort, but her own pain held her silent, a heavy chain around her heart. The terminal's lights flickered, a child's brief laughter slicing through the hum of footsteps, and Rachel's chest constricted. She'd once dreamed of a family, of a home filled with warmth and laughter, but those hopes had slipped away, leaving her with nothing but the handkerchief as a tether to who she used to be. Her fingers tightened on the fabric, its softness a stark contrast to the hardness growing inside her. She'd lost so much: love, security, faith in herself, and the flight's humiliation had reopened every wound. The city's skyline loomed beyond the glass, its towering lights a daunting promise she wasn't sure she deserved. She folded the handkerchief with care, slipping it into her coat pocket, the weight of her doubts pressing down. A tear slipped free, catching on her lashes, but she wiped it away quickly, her resolve hardening. She stood, the terminal's noise fading as she moved toward the exit, her reflection in the glass showing a woman she barely recognized. An elderly man lingered across the concourse, his frail figure leaning on a cane, his clouded eyes fixed on her coat. He clutched a faded cloth bag, his gaze intense, a whisper of recognition she didn't notice. His lips moved silently, as if speaking to a memory, and the bag shifted, revealing the edge of an envelope. Rachel paused, feeling a chill that wasn't from the air, a sense that someone saw more in her than she saw in herself. The dawn light softened, the city stirring outside, and she took a step forward, unaware that his presence carried a thread of her past, a clue to a story she hadn't yet begun to unravel. Sunlight spilled through the cafe's tall windows, casting a golden glow across the wooden tables, where the faint scent of chamomile tea hung in the air like a gentle memory. Rachel Harper sat alone near the window, her soft brown hair catching the morning light, her hands resting on an unopened cream-colored envelope, its edges curled from indecision. The city outside stirred slowly, its streets bathed in a nostalgic haze, but inside, the cafe was a quiet haven, the hum of distant conversations blending with the clink of porcelain cups. Rachel's gaze drifted to the envelope, her fingers brushing its surface, her thoughts still tangled in the flight, the baby's cries, the man's silent stare, the sting of judgment. She sighed, the weight of yesterday pressing against her chest, the handkerchief in her pocket a silent reminder of her fragile hope. The cafe door creaked open, and an elderly man stepped inside, his frail frame leaning on a cane, his weathered face etched with lines of quiet wisdom. He settled at a table near the entrance, his clouded eyes scanning the room until they landed on Rachel. She didn't notice at first, her attention on the steam rising faintly from her tea, but the air shifted, a subtle tension threading through the warmth. The old man ordered tea, his voice a low murmur, and pulled a faded cloth bag onto his lap, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted it. Rachel glanced up, catching his stare, and her breath caught, a flicker of unease stirring in her chest. His gaze held a strange familiarity, as if he knew her, as if he'd seen her before. He looked down at his bag, his fingers brushing the edge of a small envelope inside, its paper worn and creased. She tilted her head, her hand slipping to her pocket, the handkerchief's edge peeking out, its white fabric glowing softly in the light. The old man's eyes followed, narrowing slightly, a flicker of recognition passing over his face. He muttered something to himself, too quiet to hear, his hand tightening on the bag. The cafe's warmth seemed to fade for a moment, the hum of voices growing distant as Rachel's pulse quickened. She didn't know why, but his presence felt heavy, charged with an unspoken story. The waiter passed by, leaving a napkin on her table, and she offered a faint smile, her mind racing. The flight replayed again, the baby, the man, the handkerchief she'd left behind. The old man sipped his tea, his gaze steady, and whispered to himself, that day. Rachel's fingers froze on her cup, her eyes darting back to him. He didn't meet her gaze this time, but his hand rested on the bag, the envelope inside slipping slightly into view, its corner catching the light. The cafe's bell chimed as another customer entered, but Rachel's focus stayed on the old man, her heart thudding. What did he know about that flight, about her, that made his eyes so piercing? The morning light shifted, casting a shadow across her table, and the envelope in her hands felt heavier, as if it held a truth she wasn't ready to face. The cafe's amber light deepened as noon approached, shadows stretching long across the wooden floor, the scent of chamomile fading into a quiet stillness. Rachel Harper sat motionless, her soft brown hair framing her face, the cream-colored envelope now open in her lap, its letter trembling in her hands. The elderly man had slipped out moments ago, but his gaze lingered like a ghost, stirring a memory she couldn't place. The door creaked open again, and Daniel Warrick stepped inside, his tall frame filling the space, his long coat swaying with a quiet grace. His guarded eyes swept the room, landing on Rachel, and he froze, his striking features tightening with recognition. She looked up, her breath catching as he moved toward her, his bag dropping with a soft thud. From it, he pulled a white handkerchief, its folds precise, identical to the one in her pocket. Rachel's teacup slipped, clattering against the saucer, her heart pounding in her ears. That handkerchief, 3 years ago, on the flight, when she'd held his crying baby, calming her with nothing but steady hands. Her voice broke the silence. "You kept it." He nodded, his eyes glistening, and stepped closer, the cloth trembling in his grip. "I did," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You saved her, my Lily." The words hit her like a wave, the cafe seeming to slow, the clink of cups fading into a distant hum. She stood, the letter falling to the table, her hand brushing her pocket where her own handkerchief peeked out. "That day, I didn't know who you were," she whispered, her eyes searching his. He met her gaze, his face softening. "I knew you," he replied. "A preschool teacher who changed everything." The twist unfolded. He was the man from the flight, a widowed CEO, his daughter the baby she'd soothed, a bond forged in a moment neither had foreseen. The cafe's light caught the tears welling in her eyes, his tall frame leaning toward her as if drawn by an invisible thread. He reached out, his hand hovering, then dropped it, the handkerchiefs lying between them like twin beacons. "I was wrong to judge you," he said, his voice breaking. "I didn't see your heart then." Rachel's lips parted, a smile trembling through her shock, the letter's words blurring as she realized its truth, the elderly man's nod, the handkerchiefs, all pointing to a love unspoken. The room held its breath, the shadows stretching further, and the air crackled with a revelation that turned her humiliation into a miracle, a connection neither could deny. The cafe's amber glow dimmed as evening settled, casting a soft haze over the wooden tables, the air heavy with the scent of cooled tea. Rachel Harper stood across from Daniel Warrick, her soft brown hair catching the fading light, her eyes glistening with the weight of his revelation. The handkerchiefs lay between them on the table, their white fabric glowing faintly, a bridge spanning 3 years of silence. Daniel's tall frame slumped slightly, his striking features etched with shame, his guarded eyes searching hers for forgiveness. He stepped closer, his voice low and raw. "I was one of them," he said, his words trembling. "I heard them mock you on that flight, and I said nothing." Rachel's breath caught, her hand brushing the letter she'd dropped, the elderly man's words echoing in her mind, "You held her like a mother." She shook her head, her voice steady despite the tears. "You didn't know me then." Daniel sank into a chair, his hands covering his face for a moment, the handkerchief slipping to the floor. "I should have seen your kindness," he whispered, his voice breaking under the weight of regret. The cafe's hum faded, the clink of cups and distant chatter dissolving into a profound stillness, as if the room itself mourned his silence from years ago. Outside, the city's lights flickered on, their glow seeping through the windows, but inside, time seemed to pause. Rachel knelt, picking up the fallen handkerchief, her fingers brushing his as she placed it back on the table. "It's not about blame," she said softly, her smile faint but warm, a quiet strength shining through her pain. Daniel looked up, his eyes red, a tear slipping free, and reached for her hand, then stopped, his fingers trembling. "I'm sorry," he said, the words heavy, a confession long overdue. The cafe door creaked open, the elderly man returning briefly, his clouded eyes softening as he watched them, then slipping away into the dusk. Rachel met Daniel's gaze, her heart lighter, the humiliation of that flight now a distant memory, replaced by a shared understanding. The handkerchiefs sat side by side, their stitches a testament to healing, but a question lingered in the air: could this fragile moment withstand the weight of their past? Golden sunlight bathed the schoolyard, filtering through a canopy of trees, casting dappled patterns on the grass where children's laughter rang like tiny bells. Rachel Harper stood near a wooden stage, her pale blouse glowing in the afternoon light, her soft brown hair loose around her shoulders, the white handkerchief tucked into her sleeve like a quiet promise. The air smelled of fresh flowers, arranged in delicate clusters along the aisles, where parents sat in rows, their faces warm with pride. Rachel's heart felt lighter than it had in years, the sting of the flight and the weight of her losses softened by Daniel's apology in the cafe days ago. She glanced at him now, standing near the gate, his tall frame relaxed, his striking features softened by a tentative smile. Lily, his daughter, now 6, stepped onto the stage, her pigtails bouncing, a crumpled paper clutched in her small hands. The microphone crackled as she spoke, her voice small but clear. "I want to tell a story about a lady who held me on a plane when I was a baby." Rachel's breath caught, her hand tightening on the handkerchief, the schoolyard falling silent. Lily's bright eyes found her, and she continued, her words trembling with emotion. "She didn't know me, but she made me stop crying, and she saved my dad too." The crowd turned to Rachel, their whispers a soft wave, and tears welled in her eyes as Lily ran off the stage, straight into her arms. Rachel knelt, wrapping the girl in a hug, the handkerchief brushing Lily's hair, its fabric warm against them both. "Thank you," Lily whispered, her voice muffled against Rachel's shoulder. Daniel approached, his hand resting gently on Lily's back, his eyes meeting Rachel's with a quiet gratitude. The children around them clapped, their joy filling the air, a chorus of innocence that mirrored the healing in Rachel's heart. She stood, Lily's small hand in hers, and felt the weight of her past lift, replaced by a strength she'd thought she'd lost. The schoolyard glowed, its golden light a mirror to the warmth within her, but a small wooden box sat unnoticed by the gate, left by someone who knew more than he'd ever said. The schoolyard's golden light faded into a soft purple dusk, the air cooling as the last children drifted away, their laughter lingering like a fading melody. Rachel Harper sat on a bench, her pale blouse catching the last rays, her soft brown hair stirring in the gentle breeze, the white handkerchief folded neatly beside her with Lily's drawing tucked inside. The stage stood empty, flowers wilting slightly at the aisle's end, the schoolyard now a quiet canvas of memory. Daniel Warrick lingered nearby, his tall frame leaning against the gate, his striking features softened by the evening's peace, his eyes fixed on Rachel with a tenderness that needed no words. The wooden box by the gate caught her eye, left there earlier, its presence a mystery she hadn't yet explored. She rose, crossing to it, her fingers brushing the worn wood as she lifted the lid. Inside lay a tiny picture frame, holding Lily's drawing now laminated, beside it a short note in Daniel's unpolished handwriting. "You were the first she trusted before she knew what missing her mother meant. For that, I owe you everything." Rachel's breath hitched, her fingers tracing the glass, a tear slipping free as she unfolded the handkerchief, its fabric pressed and perfect for the first time. She smiled, a full, radiant smile, the kind that blooms after forgiveness, her heart whole at last. Daniel stepped closer, his hand resting on the bench, the space between them filled with a silent understanding. The city's lights twinkled beyond the trees, a distant echo of the world they'd left behind. Rachel sat again, the box beside her, and Daniel joined her, their shoulders brushing, the handkerchief a bridge between them. A young boy appeared at the gate, his small frame clutching a faded letter, his eyes searching the yard. He didn't speak, but his gaze settled on Rachel, a quiet recognition in his look, as if he carried a story of his own. The schoolyard grew still, the box and letter hinting at another kindness waiting to unfold, a circle closing and opening anew under the evening's gentle light.